This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. This week, we're going to be discussing the pressing issue of the judicial reforms that have taken place in Mexico. Well, of course, they were voted in last year, 2024, but now the dust has settled a little bit. It's good to take a look back of what this means, what took place, and how we can look at it in the long term. So we've got Julio Ríos-Figueroa on the line from Mexico. He is an associate professor at the Department of Law in ITAM in Mexico City. He received his PhD in politics from NYU, and he's an expert in comparative judicial politics, the rule of law, and empirical legal studies, focusing on the Latin American region. So it's a great honor to have you on the LatinNews Podcast, Julio.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me.
No, I think this is a very important episode. All of them are important, but this is a very important episode, especially when we've got so much movement in North America, and Mexico, North America, United States, and Canada, and so on. And we'll get to that towards the end. But let's talk about these judicial elections that took place. They took place at the very tail end of Andrés Manuel López Obrador's tenure as president, and they were approved in September 2024. Perhaps you could give us an overview of what took place, please.
Yeah, as you say, so in his last month in the presidency, Andrés Manuel López Obrador managed to get approved two very important constitutional reforms. The first one is the one that is the motive of our conversation here today. That is the judicial reform, in which we will elect all judges in the country. We already started a month ago, and we will talk about that in more detail. The second reform was a reform that militarized public security and other areas in Mexico by transferring the National Guard to the Secretary of Defense, to the Ministry of Defense. It was quite interesting because in his last month as a president, these reforms were approved by a Congress elected like a couple of months before that, in the same election in which our current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, was also elected. So López Obrador kind of took advantage of the superb electoral results of his party and the newly elected president Sheinbaum, because they got like a supermajority of legislators in both houses of Congress. And with that supermajority, he got these two reforms approved even before the new president took office on September 1st.
So it was a situation that lent itself perfectly to push through his agenda to then just be picked up by President Sheinbaum when she came into power.
Absolutely. So, when she was elected as the candidate of Morena, López Obrador party in power, she was trying to distance a little bit in order to create a political campaign that was slightly different from what he had in mind. But López Obrador, on February 2024, launched a big package of constitutional reforms, actually like a package of 18 constitutional reforms that he used to call the Plan C. And he also said it's C for Claudia, like Claudia Sheinbaum, the candidate of his party. And then that Plan C became the campaign. I mean, it took over Claudia Sheinbaum's idea of what like she wanted to run on, like the platform she wanted to run on. She embraced this Plan C, and López Obrador was very successful. I mean, and the people bought it they won. Claudia Sheinbaum won a lot of votes. I mean, 60% of the votes. And Morena and its allies won 55% of votes for the legislative power. However, due to a tricky constitutional interpretation by the Electoral Tribunal, with those 55% of the votes, they managed to get 66 plus 6 in the Deputies House and also the Senate. And it was with this supermajority that López Obrador, before handing power to Claudia Sheinbaum, passed these two reforms. And then Claudia Sheinbaum has been approving or pushing for the approval of other reforms within that Plan C.
So, I mean, we can say then that despite, well, as she was on campaign, Sheinbaum's decision and wish to distance herself, she didn't. She was almost uncompromisingly pushed back towards López Obrador's, his package.
Yeah, she did. And I can tell you that for sure in the case of the judicial reform, for instance, López Obrador wanted to have every single judge in the country elected. However, she publicly said, well, I mean, it's okay to elect judges, but probably let's just keep it to the Supreme Court and probably another high court, and we can have the rest of the judges in the country just, be selected through a judicial career as we. She said that. I'm her advisor in judicial affairs, a former justice in the Supreme Court, that also. But then López Obrador launched his plan with the judicial reform, saying every single judge in the country will be elected. And then she kind of said, she was a politician in campaign. So she said, I won't fight it. I will go with it in the campaign. But surprisingly, López Obrador had this reform passed before he handed power. And then Claudia Sheinbaum she has pushed the reform through. And that is true for other details as well in her initial plan.
Which other details can we, as you say, you were mentioning there?
Well, in the case of the security strategy, for instance, that's also super important for Mexico. So Claudia Sheinbaum is Mexico. She was the mayor of Mexico City for 6 years. And Mexico City has a very different security strategy. Mexico City has actual police. That is it's one of the most efficient police bodies in the country. And crime rates in Mexico City are under control. I mean, are high as a big city, but it's are under control. And all drug-related issues are also let's say, not as out of control as in other states in the country. So López Obrador, on the contrary, pushed for using the military to control public security and to fight cartels. So she had an idea of public security that was different in the sense that she didn't want the military to play such an important role as López Obrador had pushed for. That is another reform that López Obrador just passed before handing power. So López Obrador kind of revitalized his public security strategy. He put the National Guard in the hands of the military before handing power to Claudia Sheinbaum. So so she was forced to accept that. Claudia Sheinbaum's Minister of Public Security is trying now, especially because of the Trump administration's pressures to do something related to regarding drug cartels. She had used a slightly different strategy than López Obrador, because she is fighting more head to head the drug cartels, something that López Obrador avoided. And she is trying to build a more civilian or civilian-ish strategy for public security. but still, I mean, she inherited López Obrador, big scheme of public security, that has the military front and center.
So when you say public security, we're talking about the police forces. And so the police forces being put under the Ministry of Defense, which is, it takes them away from being slightly, let's say, socially minded. It makes them an armed actor within the country. It would suggest in that situation, the only other times I can think of this, I'm sure there are other, but in Colombia, for example, the police force is part of the military Ministry of Defense because, of course, of the internal conflict. This would suggest in Mexico then there's an acceptance of a, well, let's say, inverted commas, internal conflict with organized crime and narco trafficking.
Yes, absolutely. And that, I mean, the direct exposure of the military to like the potential corrupt potential of the criminal organizations. So right now in Mexico, we no longer have a federal police force. What we do have is a National Guard that is under control of the Secretary of Defense and that is populated by military personnel that has military and then has like military jurisdiction. The National Guard is under the armed forces. It's like the third leg of armed forces after the army and the marine So some states in Mexico still have like a civilian police. In some states, even the chief of the civilian police are for military or military men in service. In others, as in Mexico City, we still have a civilian police.
Oh.
But at the federal level, security is militarized.
So, I mean, it brings me to asking, I know we're sort of veering off, but these are all the reforms that were pushed through. But I have to ask, what does or did López Obrador stand to gain, or his circle, I guess, stand to gain from militarizing the police and these judicial reforms? Because they don't sound like this does seem to move towards a degree of autocracy.
Well, I think, Mexico has been in the process of what scholars call democratic backsliding, that since López Obrador won the presidency, he very explicitly launched a campaign against the public media, the universities, NGOs, the autonomous constitutional organs, the judiciary, and he concentrated power in the executive branch and the army, the armed forces. So that lasted for like 6 years. It was a process of backsliding. In a sense, it culminated in the success of his strategy because we did have elections in 2024. And as you mentioned, López Obrador party did very well. And his pick for president, that was Claudia Sheinbaum, also did very well. So the Mexican voters approved of this process of concentration of power in the executive branch and militarization, and also, the judicial elections. I mean, they did some things. For instance, in the way how they got the supermajority in the elections, the legislative supermajority enabled them to push these constitutional reforms. That was not, let's say, kosher. They really they won 55% of the legislative vote. But then with this treat in accounting and with the failure of the electoral court that they had co-opted beforehand, like a year before, and then they got the supermajority in the Senate and the House of Deputies. So yes, it is part of, as López Obrador openly says, I mean, he conceives his project as the big fourth transformation in Mexico's history. I mean, he's not humble about it. He mentions the independence from Spain, the war between liberals and conservatives in the 19th century, the Mexican social revolution in the 1910s, and his period. So he conceives his project as this big event in Mexico's history. So he pushed for the consolidation of his power that comes hand in hand with the erosion of the democratic institutions that Mexico had been built in the previous 30 years.
So, yeah, Lopez Obrador's humility aside, or lack of humility aside, if we could move on a little bit and just say, well, when we go back to the judicial reforms, who are some of the key new magistrates? And in particular, I'm looking at Hugo Aguilar. What does he represent?
Yeah, so Hugo Aguilar will become the next Chief Justice. He will assume office September 1st, so in like an days. He was the most voted candidate for the Supreme Court, which makes him the Chief Justice. I mean, that was the reform said. So let me just put in context what this means. So in Mexico, we will elect every single judge in the country. Mexico is a federal country. We have 32 states, which has each state has a state judiciary. All judges in all states will be elected, but we also have federal judiciary. It's very similar to the US. Last June 1st, we hold the elections. At the federal level, we elected only half of the federal judges, and only half of the states also elected their judges. The next half, or the second half of the federal judiciary, will be elected in 2027.
Yes.
And in 2027, the other half of the states will elect their judges too. So we elected 9 judges for the Supreme Court out of 64 candidates that registered for that position. And the most voted was this person, Hugo Aguilar, who won the most votes and will become the Chief Justice. He's an interesting character. I don't know him much, but people who know him say that he is like a good lawyer. I mean, he has been a lawyer who defends causes for the indigenous community for a long time. At some point, he even worked for or consulted for the Pista Army of National Liberation, in Chiapas, the movement in 1994. So he has 0 judicial experience. So he's a good lawyer. He has been a litigant, like a kind of legal mobilizator, if we can say that, but no experience as a judge. So he will become Chief Justice, and he hasn't worked a single day in a court as a judge. No. He has been in front of judges, but not being a judge. However, he got elected in part, or probably mainly, because he worked in the last 6 years with López Obrador. He was the lawyer for López Obrador, especially in charge of, organizing the consultations with the indigenous communities that didn't want some of the main infrastructure projects of López Obrador to be built in their communities, such as the Maya train that went through the Maya jungle and cost a lot of communities, Mayan communities in the south of the country, or the trans-oceanic train that also, so a lot of the communities didn't want their land to be expropriated for these projects. And in Mexico, these communities have what it is called the right of prior consultation. I mean, they have to be consulted whether they want these projects to be built on their land. They didn't want, so Hugo Aguilar was the lawyer working this time not for the communities, but for the government, who managed to get the consultations done and approved and get the projects approved. So he worked closely with López Obrador. The projects were approved. They were kind of just rammed through the communities. The army was in charge of building part of this project. So these projects were not done by civilian constructors. López Obrador considered these projects like key for national security and national development, and handed big portions of this project to the military to be built. So Hugo Aguilar was working for the government in getting, these communities to accept the project. And a lot of people say it they were not proper consultations. They were done very quickly by hand in the public square, but he was effective for López Obrador's government. And then he got this promotion by the government in the judicial elections, and finally will become the Chief Justice.
We can suggest that Hugo Aguilar understood how these communities worked, having worked as a litigator for them, and having been an activist for, let's say, left-wing extremism, if we want to talk about the EZLN and Subcomandante Marcos. And it sounds like an incredibly savvy move by López Obrador to bring Hugo Aguilar in, obviously promise him, obviously the payment there is the return on his work is his position today. It's quite concerning, in truth. And you've got a guy who's never spent any time, let's say, sitting in the main seat in a court. I'm a little bit short of words on this one. I think perhaps the Mexican public should be concerned.
Well, yes and no. So López Obrador government was the first government from the left, from the ideological left, to win elections in Mexico. So that is also important. Since the transition to democracy in Mexico at the end of the 90s, and especially clearly in the 2000s, when the party that governed Mexico for 70 years lost the presidential election for the first time, we had the right of center party called the PAN, Partido Acción Nacional, winning elections, and then the former PRI winning elections. So we had three sexenios, three administrations of 6 years with parties from the center right governing. So in 2018, when López Obrador won the election, it was the first time a government from the left won election. So a lot of people who is left-leaning in the country was very happy with it. López Obrador is a very charismatic man. He enjoyed a huge approval rates during his 6 years. So yes, it is. They did this reform and they did these projects, with little consideration for details such as the right to private consultation and some community, but also with the approval of all huge chunks of the population, also in the south of the country. So it's not as black and white. Now, what happened at the end, the approval of the judicial election, the militarization of public security, also other reforms of the militarization reform, also other reforms that build the autonomous constitutional organs and concentrate more power in the executive room, that becomes more worrisome, because as you say, the new Chief Justice, and I can say the entire Supreme Court is very close to the new government. It's very close to the governing party, Morena. They got because they were voted in cheats in the election, because we had 64 candidates for the Supreme Court, but in the election there were 3,400 candidates. it was really impossible for people to learn, like, who was in the election, who was competing. And also campaigns were not prohibited by law. It was a really poorly designed reform. But what happened is that the government, Claudia Sheinbaum's government, and people close to her party, Morena, distributed this list of people, that the voters had to choose from.
Mm.
And these, so we call them in Mexico acordeones. No, it's like a cheat sheet. And so Hugo Aguilar was in those. In order to be present in those lists, you had to be close to the governing party, to the governors, to the executive branch. So he was listed in these cheat sheets, and he won. And so did the other 9 members in the Supreme Court. So it is concerning. At the same time, I have to say, in service after the election, a majority of the poll accept the reform, and it's 50-something% of the population said, well, it's fine. A little less than half of the people surveyed say that they expect the justice system in Mexico to be better after the reform. I don't think that will be the case, but that is what the people perceives. In answering to your question, so it is concerning, yes. However, this has been done not directly regarding, the legal procedures, the institutional limitations, but yes, with the approval of the majority of the people, or at least tacit approval of the majority of the people.
Tacit approval. I mean, obviously, the big concern that jumps out at me here is the issue of checks and balances, and I find it fascinating as well that the Morena party, led, of course, by President Sheinbaum, I mean, she says that these reforms and this voting and so on is essential to tackle corruption, which, again, you can argue both ways, I guess.
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, the judicial reform in particular, was very poorly designed from the very beginning. I mean, it was a campaign tool for López Obrador, the judicial reform and the other 18 reforms. And then it became a reality. The reform in the legislative process per se, it was not amended at all. It was approved without changing a single comma from what López Obrador presented during the campaign. Why? Because if it was changed, then he wouldn't have had enough time to pass the reform before leaving office. The result is that the reform, had, for instance, there were some selection committees to pick up the candidate, and they had only 1 month to check whether the 20,000 plus aspirants to candidates are eligible or not. In a month, they couldn't do it well, so we had a lot of problems. Another thing is related to you mentioned. I mean, whether this reform will tackle corruption. It will not, Richard. I mean, I can say that confidently. The justice system in Mexico is corrupt. I mean, we know that. We have really good diagnosis, and we have had them for a lot of years, like 10 or more years. But the main determinant of corruption in the justice system in Mexico are the prosecutorial organs, both at the state and the federal level. This judicial reform does not touch the prosecutorial organs.
Mhm.
It goes directly to the judges, and the federal judges in particular. And the federal judges in Mexico were kind of the best part of the justice system, because the federal judges had been undergoing a meritocracy reform in the democracy years since 1994. So really, this judicial reform was a campaign issue for López Obrador, who took advantage of the perception in the population that the justice system as such is corrupt. That is true. But instead of going after the institution that produces this corruption, that is the prosecutors that are under executive control, he did go for the judges, and especially the federal judges that were becoming and were in his government a check on what the government could do.
Yeah.
So this reform amounts to an undermining of judicial independence and the system of checks and balances in the country.
So yes, as you said, the implications for judicial independence are troubling, and it's certainly a politicization of the courts. I don't see this then being, well, I mean, could it be effective in the fight against organized crime if you've got everyone on side, or is it going to be something that just sort of, I mean, as you know, López Obrador didn't want to tackle this head on, the organized crime. So how will President Sheinbaum fare in this?
So, I mean, she won't have a check on her government coming from the judiciary.
Yeah.
That is for sure. So in the cases that matter for the government, she won't have a limit.
Yeah.
And I am thinking about, for instance, some fiscal cases that are very important for the government, some security cases. The government in Mexico wants, and her government, Claudia Sheinbaum's government, has been promoting the detention of people without a sentence, like preventive detention on automatic terms. So if you are charged with a crime, and the list of those crimes are like 20 crimes, about 20 crimes, then you are automatically detained, go to jail, and you will be investigated while in jail to see if there is enough evidence to keep you there. So it's like a kind of mano dura, ironist policy regarding crime. That will be good for her. In her perspective, no, the judiciary will not be a check on that. The previous Supreme Court was about to declare unconstitutional this automatic preventive detention. That Claudia Sheinbaum openly came, publicly said, I don't want that. We do want the automatic public detention. Even though it goes against the Mexican Constitution, it goes against the Inter-American Charter, the rights. She wants that because they consider that this is effective to fight crime. So in that sense, it will be good. Good for her.
Yes.
Bad for I think bad for public security in the long term. And in other cases that are important for the government, the judiciary won't be a problem. Either the Supreme Court and the judges will decide in favor of the government, and if they don't, the reform includes a tribunal of judicial discipline that is also like an invention of this reform, that is a kind of ex post check. So if some judges make an incorrect decision, they will be, there will be complaints against them before the Tribunal of Judicial Discipline, and this Tribunal of Judicial Discipline, whose members were also elected and also are very close to López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum, so they will make sure that the judges are kind of corrected, their sentences corrected, because this Tribunal of Judicial Discipline has a lot of powers to check judges, not only for procedural mistakes, but also for substantive interpretations. The tribunal consider that are not correct.
So the long-term effect of this could be so very impacting for Mexico. And I can see the populist side of things. If there's a publicly announced drop in crime, and major figures who are perceived to have committed crimes are taken down and imprisoned, I can see that being popular to the Sheinbaum loyalists and, of course, to a great deal of the public as well. It's a lot about public perception, isn't it? But it is an erosion of democracy. I mean, we've talked a lot about checks and balances and so on. But there is the US, Mexico, Canada agreement, and it's coming up for review. And I wonder what your thoughts on this are.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there are some analysts that say that the judicial reform violates some of the terms of the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, commercial agreement, and that will be on the table for sure when Mexico sits with the U.S. and Canada for the renegotiation of the treaty. We already know that the reform has created a lot of uncertainty for business people, that this uncertainty comes on top of the uncertainty that President Trump has already inserted in the relationship between the three countries to the tariffs and his policies. So what happens that then is these are essentially, I think, like the business people will kind of adapt in the sense of just charging a higher interest rate for lending Mexico money and for higher risks in how the cases will be decided, or not more certainty that they will lose the case if they go against the government. There will, whenever they can, they can avoid the judicial system, they will avoid, for example, private arbitration. I think is going to go up. We are already seeing that. A lot of new arbitration terms are opening up. The end result, we don't know. I think the government in Mexico and the judiciary will have to adapt. I mean, at least to be able to separate efficiently the cases that are important for government from the cases that are quote unquote regular cases that need to be resolved with efficiency and expediency. Because the people, the Mexican citizens that have to go to courts to solve their conflict, and also the business community will want that. I don't know how Mexico will do that for sure, but eventually they will have to do it. Otherwise, we will have a period of chaos because the learning curve of the new judges will be steep. The top experience, not only the members of the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice, as I mentioned, in general, the elected judges, some colleagues, I did this calculation. In average, the elected judges have 20 years less of experience as lawyers than the judges that are living. They are younger. They don't have experience in the judiciary. They don't have legal experience, period, like 20 years less of legal experience, measured in terms of the years that passed since they got their law degree until 2025. So in average, 20 years less. So it will be a very steep learning curve.
I can see a positive for the government of President Sheinbaum when she needs to sort of push back on President Trump's threats to, send in the military to get the cartels, and indeed about the whole militarization of the border and stop the migrants and the bandits from crossing, where she will be able to hold up judicial successes and say, but look what we've done. I can see her playing a long game in this. Is this a potential outcome?
That's interesting. And I think you are right for some cases. But there's also the other side of the coin. Sometimes governments benefit for pointing the finger to another actor. So when they do not want to do something, they can say, oh, I would love to, but judges won't let it. It's unconstitutional. I cannot do that. That is no longer available in Mexico because the judiciary is very close to the government's preferences. Yes, they will have some victories, but then they will also no longer have the option to point to the judges and say, I would love to do that, but I cannot. No, because the US government is saying, why not? Actually, we have seen that, Richard. President Trump has been really pressuring Mexico for fighting off the cartel.
Yeah.
And Mexico has delivered to the US close to 50 people. And I use the word carefully, delivered, not extradited. So Mexico has delivered to the US 50 persons that were imprisoned in Mexico with no process. Just as President Trump sent people to El Salvador and to other countries without due process, Mexico is doing that with members of the cartels that the US wants without due process. So they don't have the option to say, oh, I would like to hand them. The judges require me to go through the proper extradition process. They just do it.
So herein lies the automatic public preventive detention coming through for the Sheinbaum administration. If as we wind this down, Julio, if we say that the Mexican government can no longer blame the judiciary, who will they blame?
Well, so that's a great question.
Because they have to. I mean, there's always someone to blame, surely.
Yeah, and actually, like some of the analysts that favor the government, that are close to the government, they are actually saying, so we need an opposition. So the government needs someone to blame. It's having a lot of power, concentrating a lot of power is not always good. So you need to point the finger at someone. They are still blaming the opposition, even though the opposition is a minority in Congress, lost all the state. I mean, almost all the states are governed by Morena. But the bad reputation of the PRI and the PAN has still, is still used so deep, this bad reputation, that the government is still using it. They are kind of blaming also the US and Trump, but that's tricky because we are partners in this international agreement, commercial agreement. So yeah, they do need some villain in the movie to blame for the mistakes. That's an open question, Richard. I don't know. Right now, there are strong tensions within Morena, within the governing coalition, strong tensions. There are different groups in that movement. Actually, Morena stands for Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, like Movement of National Regeneration. It is not a political party, a movement, and in it, there are many very different groups, former priistas, people from, unions, and they are now blaming each other because they are trying to see who is going to become the most important group within the party. So that is like a really interesting thing to watch in Mexico politics in the near future. Whether Morena will become like a political party that can discipline the different groups within it. If they can, they will have to find a villain, and if do these two things, they will probably rule for a quite long time.
I could see the government looking around and then doing a sort of purge of those former priistas and other parties who are easy to blame for the past and, let's say, the present situation. But so very interesting and certainly something to watch. I will be watching closely the situation. Truly fascinating to see this. It's a concentration of power and authority, definitely. So let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Julio Ríos Ríos-Figueroa, Associate Professor at the Department of Law at ITAM in Mexico City. It has been a truly fascinating conversation with plenty of things to consider. So thank you again for coming on the LatinNews Podcast, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future, perhaps talking about less democratic backsliding and maybe some positive moves in the judicial system.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Richard.
Well, I've been Richard McCall, your host here for the LatinNews Podcast. We come back every 2 weeks discussing issues from the region and important to the region of Latin America. Be sure to subscribe. We are on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and everywhere else. Thank you again, and goodbye.